Hello and welcome to the DIF. I've got some good news and some bad news. The bad news is it's the last day of our November DIF event. The good news is that we've still got a lot of really good content and good sessions, starting with this one, which will look at the topics of circular economy and frugal innovation. My name is Seb, and I'll be your host for the next 30 to 45 minutes. And I'll be working with our speakers and hosts today to get your questions answered. So make sure you post those through on the right-hand side in the comment space at thinkdiff.co. Make sure that if you have already navigated to the YouTube video, you can use the comment section there, or you can tweet us using hashtag thinkdiff. So today we're talking about the topic of frugal innovation and its role in allowing circular economy to happen. For as long as we've known humans, there's been various forms of innovation. Often that's been with significant resource constraints. So today I'm joined by experts and people who know what this is like firsthand from across the world. We've got stories today from Asia, South America, and Europe. And I suppose maybe the first question to ask you, Vivek, is what is frugal innovation and why is it interesting for the circular economy?
Thanks, Seb. Thanks for the introduction. It's wonderful to be in the DIF session. So our concept on frugal innovations and circular economy as a pathway to sustainability evolved from the practices that we are seeing throughout the developing and developed countries. So frugal innovations basically means using minimum resources and maximize your efficiency and production. So there is not an old-fashioned concept of divide between the West and the East currently. And there is actually a transfer of technology and ideas between both developed and developing countries. And systemic thinking and interdependencies exist throughout. So we thought frugality, how frugal innovation is existing and how it is contributing to circularity and how these work together to contribute to the various sustainable development goals. So we have an amazing bunch of speakers from throughout the world now to discuss about this topic. We have First, let me introduce Adriana from Brazil. She is a researcher in the Wuppertal Institute who will be discussing on forest conservation practices and forest goals and how circular economy and frugal innovation plays a vital role in helping and supporting sustainable development goals. So followed by, we have Henning Wills from Wuppertal Institute, who is the director of circular economy, who would discuss about the practices in Europe and what are the gaps existing. And it would be interesting to hear from Henning on this aspect. And finally, I would be discussing along with Peter on aspects of frugal innovations in the Indian subcontinent and what all ideas are practically possible. So we would be trying to take you through a session where we'll be showing how this transition is going to happen. So first, we will be trying to discuss the practices of frugality and circularity from South America, from Brazil. Adriana would be discussing that, followed by the cases from Europe. And then we will be transitioning to Asia from Indian subcontinent. And that's how our presentation would try to work. So let's start our presentation with Adriana. Adriana, can you?
Thank you, Vivek. Good morning. So I'm going to talk about circular economy and forest conservation. An overview of this complex scenario. So,
Adriana, can you just unmute yourself?
Sorry. Good morning. Thank you, Vivek. I will talk about circular economy and forest conservation. So I would like to start with some big numbers just to give an overview of this complex scenario. So in 2018, we lost an area of 3.6 million hectares of forests, and Brazil and Indonesia were responsible for almost 50% of this worldwide forest, tropical deforestation. So, and at least in my country, in Brazil, this rate is going to increase once we had the Amazon fires this year. And it's happening in other regions, also in Australia and also in US. It's estimated that the fires produced nearly 141 million metric tons of carbon dioxide only in Brazil. And what I want to highlight is that the Amazon rainforest, until 20 years ago, it was performing a very important environmental service, that it's to retain up to 2 billion of carbon dioxide per year. But now this is approaching to zero. So technically now the carbon can be considered carbon neutral. Okay, so when we have this that amount, the loss of amount of area, we have a significant biodiversity loss also. And all those impacts I mentioned, they are directly linked to growing demand for forest risk commodities such as soy and beef and palm oil. And over the last decade, the demand for those commodities have been responsible for causing over 50% of deforestation in tropical and subtropical countries. And until 2025, the demand for those commodities will increase around 40%. On the other hand, we have some important frameworks widespread, which can turn into new opportunities, such as the SDGs that Vivek already mentioned, the Global Forest Goals that some of you might never heard about it. So briefly explaining, in 2017, the UN featured the first ever UN strategic plan for forests, which provides a global framework to how deforestation and forest degradation. And at the heart of these strategic plans, we have those 6 global forest goals and 26 targets to be achieved into 2030, sorry. And they aim to contribute to progress on the SDGs, the Aichi targets, biodiversity targets, and the Paris Agreement. And last but not least, the UN declared it the decade of restoration from 2021 into 2030. That aims to massively scale up the restoration of degraded and destroyed ecosystems. So the link here with frugal innovation that Vivek already mentioned also, and forest conservation, is how we are going to use technology and less land to produce more food and upcycle degraded land into productive areas. And also rethink the traditional model of forest risk commodities production. So we can develop a vision underpinned by circular economy principles to curb deforestation and promote land restoration in all degraded biomes. This is an important point, not only in forests, but all biomes. And how do we do that? So today I would like to highlight 3 main measures. The first one we can talk is sustainable intensification. So how to produce more food based on a sustainable business model. About 40% of the carbon stored is in the soil. So we are talking about a very effective adaptation measure. That's why you have to guarantee a soil to soil cycle and maintain the ecosystem regeneration capacity. And most importantly, the implementation of this business model requires stakeholder approaches. So together also with risk and impact assessments. The second would be enhance the ecosystem resilience. So we have to achieve land degradation neutrality and guarantee food security. And for that, we need to use landscape approaches which aim to improve human well-being in a broad sense, rather than just minimizing only environmental impacts. So in this topic, we have a few gaps, such as how to measure a successful restoration area, like methodologies, which criteria, KPIs, social and environmental impacts assessments, again, like the effects in different biomes, the central role of communities, and also regarding the national and subnational commitments to restore degraded landscapes, what would be an effective commitment? For example, in my country, in Brazil, 82% of the promised restoration is actually monoculture plantations. And in China, this figure can be more than 95%. And the third one would be to close the loop within this commodity supply chain, and most importantly, to tackle the social impacts in the whole value chain. We have to disrupt the traditional model that is supplying commodities for further processing and generate the values away from its origin. And at the same time, enable a long-term value creation through an inclusive bioeconomy, apply it to ecosystem service. So the big gap here is how to monetize natural capital. And about the social costs. Okay, so we apply the frugal mindset. How do we achieve systemic changes in the value chain if you don't know the actual costs? So we have a big challenge here to use a community-based approach, and stakeholders have to be included in the solution design to upcycle this degraded land and to produce food. Okay, so I would like to briefly talk about a study case in Brazil. For frugality approaches, we have
one very quick question, Adrian. I'm really sorry to interrupt you. Just as something online that sort of speaks to this. Who are the just so we're clarified, who are the key stakeholders that you're talking about there when you talk about bringing people around the table?
If we think about the forest risks, the commodity supply chains, the producer and local communities mainly, because they have to be closer to the retailers and the consumers. So for this approach, we are mainly talking about the most affected people in the field.
So the people extracting the resources and the people who live in the area where the resources are being extracted. Thank you. That's really helpful.
So as I was saying, in Brazil, we have some good examples for take-back schemes with tires, oil, and pesticides packaging. But today I would like to comment briefly on a successful case, community-based approach. The company is Natura. I think Natura is very well known for everybody. It has developed a project that pays for carbon offsetting in its production chain, known as circular carbon, that remunerates communities for environmental conservation. Okay, that in 1 year, current Natura has close to 6,000 supplier families, and in 2018 were distributed nearly 8 million euros, which represents income of almost 700 euros per family per year. So the rate of deforestation of those areas correspond to less than half of the average of deforestation rate in the surrounding areas, and avoided emissions of almost 100,000 of carbon dioxide. So that's it for me.
Yeah.
Thank you. I will hand over to Vivek again.
Yeah, thank you, Adriana, for that. It was really inspiring to hear about the forest goals and how it's connected to the circular economy and frugal innovation part, and how we are trying to achieve sustainability. Now let's navigate to Europe, where Henning would be discussing the present major issue, which is the plastic waste, and how projects are trying to manage this, and is there frugality existing, or are there any gaps existing for this? So over to you, Henning.
Thank you very much, Vivek. I'd like to talk a little bit about the European perspective on circularity and plastics, and especially what happens if you lack ideas for frugal innovation. Obviously, plastics is a topic everyone talks about, and there's an urgent need for action.
Sorry, Henning. Sorry, just I feel like you've got a microphone on your headset there. I think if you could just move it down a bit.
Oh, I hope that's better.
Yeah, we can hear you a bit clearer. Thank you.
Yeah, so obviously plastics is a topic that everyone talks about, and there's an urgent need for action. In 2018, the global production was about 380 million tons, and only 15% of that was recycled, leading to massive environmental problems that we became increasingly aware of over the last year. And at the same time, we need plastics for sustainable resource management. Our problems would become even worse if we would switch completely to more resource-intensive materials like metals, or even to bio-based materials. And exactly on this issue, I'd like to share with you some experience from my home country, Germany, the self-proclaimed world champion in recycling. Here we have a recovery rate, for example, for plastic packaging of 99%, but nevertheless, we're far away from closed material loops. Actually, the share of recycled materials in plastic packaging is below 10%. And in our research, we try to understand the dynamics of the systems. And for me, I think it's the exact opposite of a frugal innovation. Germany tries to solve the problem with technical end-of-pipe innovations that cost a huge amount of money, 1 billion euro every year. So from a resource efficiency point of view, you see that it's extremely inefficient. If you look at the policies, you really see how helpless we are. The total amount of plastic packaging waste has doubled over the last 20 years, and it's steadily increasing. We're now involved in a new waste alliance called Prevent with international partners. And in the beginning, the idea was to collect best practices from Germany that could be implemented in our partner countries like Ghana and Indonesia. But we're increasingly realizing that it should be the other way around. Germany is discovering its need for frugal innovation. So my key message, don't trust too much in technology. On a global scale, we need more efficient systemic innovations, and frugality should become a key criterion for further research, development, and of course also for policymaking. Back to you, Vivek.
Thanks, Henning, for that brief and very exciting explanation on these aspects. Now, I think there are some solutions which exist in the developing countries, the developing hemisphere, which has so many frugal ideas which had been existing because resources were short and the countries had to go through the economic crisis. So let me bring an example from India. So it's a very popular system called the Dabbawalas, or the lunchbox system, which tries to package the food items in steel containers, use the local network for transport of food items, and such a frugal network has been existing for the past more than 100 years. It's exciting to see that for the past 100 years, such a system is existing, and still this system is working perfectly without the help of any kind of innovations or digital technologies. So I'll just give a small glimpse of the practice. Yeah, so as you can see, this is the amazing Dabbawala system from India. So it's very popular in Mumbai. So as you can see, the system of dabbas has been existing for more than 100 years. How it happens is you collect the material from the homes or the restaurant which produces the food items, you pack it in steel containers, transport it by cycle without the use of any motorized vehicles. That means less fossil fuel usage. And you transport it to the local train stations. As you can see, in the trains are being loaded with this material, with the food items, and then they are shifted to the companies where the people are working. So the food is packed from the home and you are managing to take it to the offices, which is very fresh food with less plastic use, or there is no plastic involved in packaging of the food items, which is quite appreciable. And this system is supposed to be a Six Sigma performance rating system with 99.9999% of efficiency, 6.9 performance. The error is, so the motto of this Dabbawala system is that error is horror. So as you can see, this system has been existing because there was a need or necessity for such practices, and there was a lack of resources in olden days. So this system developed its own, and it's now one of the best practice system on food logistics management. At the same time, they are also involved on different practices, like they take back the reverse logistics, like they take back the dabbas back to their back to the homes where the food came from, and also they are involved in other sustainable initiatives inclusive of the social inclusivity, for example, including the vulnerable communities in their program, and they also deliver organic raw materials for the food, to name a few. So this system is quite unique, and it could be replicated in any part of the world. The highlight is that they don't use much digital technologies. They believe that digital technologies might hinder their efficiency. So this is a community-based business model for sustainable development. We use the local network, we use the manpower, and the reverse logistics happen. Now moving on, I have to show one more idea. This is called the informal sector in India. The informal sector is such a powerful sector which tries to recycle maximum waste in India, and this contributes to a lot of GDP of India. And it is essential. We need to empower this informal sector and formalize so that the other communities, the informal communities, are also brought into the circular business models that we try to develop, aiming for sustainable development. So we need to formalize the sector, and I believe now Peter can take over from here and discuss how his company is trying to work from with the informal sector, and how his a plastic crediting platform is also working. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Vivek. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Very, very well, thank you.
Perfect. I'll just share my screen. If Vivek, if you can stop share, I could share my screen as well. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Peter Oyemdal. I'm a co-founder of Repurpose. Thanks, Vivek, for the introduction. We are a global community of conscious consumers and businesses going plastic neutral. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey of repurpose and how frugality is a crucial part of our impact model, of our ecosystem, and the way that we work as an organization. So the way we started was actually about 2.5 years ago when my co-founders and I found ourselves in one of Asia's largest landfills in Mumbai, India. And there was a moment when we got out of the car and we realized that while we're standing between mountains of plastic on the one side, and on the other side, you had this massive infinite skyline of India's financial capital. And that's when we realized something went wrong about the way our society produces and manages waste on a daily basis. And just as we were coming out of the landfill, we struck up with waste pickers. And this was the first time we had seen members of the informal workforce, and struck up a conversation with one of them. I still remember his name was Bilal. And at one point during the conversation, he pointed to the big sack of plastic bottles on his back and said to us, "Hey, you probably threw away one of these bottles after using it for 15 minutes, but this has been my work and my livelihood for the past 20 years. And that for us really formed the backbone of who we are as a social enterprise today, because we realized that the informal sector picked up where we had left off as a society and actually started dealing with the consequences of our consumption, all because of a lack of financing and funding for formal infrastructure for waste management, collection, and recycling. And they do a great job at it. In Delhi, for example, in India, over 15% of entire solid waste management is actually managed by the informal sector. And about $5 million per year saved because of that. So they play an important role and will continue to do so going forward. But I thought I would take you guys through a little bit of a case study about what frugality really means, because they were frugal not because they wanted to, but because they had to. So looking to Mumbai, which is one of the most vibrant shadow recycling sectors, Bombay as a city was a maritime trading hub under colonial rule, but when after India gained its independence, the city's manufacturing industries boomed and became a major job destination. As people actually moved in, the infrastructure started deteriorating because it was overloaded. Haphazard developments of slums and proliferation of informal settlements, and managing waste was an equally haphazard affair. The landfill that I had mentioned before, Deonar East, it has that area has a life expectancy of 35 years old, which is essentially about half of the city's life expectancy. But even when that's happening, informal workforce actually recognized the value in such an environmental problem and started picking up the waste and recycling it. Even if they're homeless or extremely underprivileged, I mean, these informal workers got to understand waste as a material, paper, plastic, metal. And I've seen firsthand waste pickers who can sort waste into 40 different categories with their eyes closed. And that's an insane thing, because the amount of tacit knowledge that informal workers have gained because of our environmental problem is incredible. And one of these slums actually turned into one of the industrial powerhouses, especially with the recycling sector in focus, $1 billion plus GDP, and 2 million people in the area called Dharavi, in a space that is as big as maybe Soho in Manhattan in New York City. So they're doing great stuff. I mean, there's obviously a lot of things that are missing in terms of ethicality, and they can be further empowered to take on a much bigger and central role in tackling the plastic and the waste problem in the developing world. And there are amazing organizations that are doing that. And they are great at building recycling systems, great at engaging informal workforces, but are simply underfunded. And their story, adventure stories, are also a story of frugality, because they have never been in the limelight of the global circular economy picture. It had to be, hard for them to raise capital, and they had to kind of, do things the hard way and build a business from the ground. But we need to empower them to actually have a fighting chance to be able to enable ethical and efficient waste management in the developing world. So that's kind of all the story came together, and that's where Repurpose comes in as the world's first plastic crediting platform. So we are essentially a platform, a connector between two players: plastic waste producers on the one side and plastic waste removers on the other side. And the way it works is very simple. For every 25 cents contributed to the platform, we guarantee to remove and recycle 1 additional pound of plastic waste, otherwise landfilled, burned or flushed into the oceans in collaboration with our vetted partners on the ground. So what it does really is that we are unlocking crucial climate finance from conscious consumers and businesses who want to go plastic neutral and take impact and create impact now and deploy money on the ground into organizations to actually help them scale up further, all behind the idea of plastic neutrality and recycling and creating quantifiable impact on the ground. So currently working with countries across Asia, Africa, and South America. We are growing as a global platform. Yeah, so I'll end there with a short case study about how exactly it works on the consumer side. So we work with a lot of different kind of players, but especially with consumer goods companies who can actually measure their plastic footprint with us with their product packaging, compensated for essentially about 50 cents per kilogram. And we work with organizations on the ground to actually intercept and recycle, especially low value plastic waste that would have otherwise definitely ended up in the environment if it wasn't for the contribution of offset payments in order to actually subsidize the operations of plastic waste otherwise that don't have value in the supply chain. So yeah, that's just a little bit about repurpose and a lot about the story. Yeah, if you guys are interested, we'd love to kind of, it's repurpose.global and feel free to contact us. But thanks so much.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks.
Just a quick clarifying question from me, Peter.
Yeah.
I guess some of our audience at home might be thinking, or may even be writing questions as we speak. The example of waste of people collecting waste in the informal sector in countries in Asia and Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
It's an example of frugality, but as you kind of said yourself, out of necessity. Is the answer to that? Is that a positive story about frugality? I suppose is my question, or how do we frame that positively?
Yeah, I think what I meant by necessity is not that it's negative. It's more the source of where the frugal innovation was motivated from, right? I think I'm painting a very positive picture, not negative at all, in the sense that I think that it is any waste management system in the developing world that does not involve the informal sector will not work at scale. And they, the necessity was the reason why they got started. And they had to be frugal because frugal literally meant that they had to use waste. And nobody grows up or, and think about, hey, I want to work in, and in waste picking, right? That's what I meant by necessity. But what I mean going forward is that, that frugal thinking is something, and the tacit knowledge, the informal knowledge that is not captured in the formal circular economy white papers is something that is important to actually consider and keep in mind going forward.
Thanks for that, Peter. That's helpful.
So thanks, Peter, for that great examples that you have shared. So we basically believe collectively that frugality and circularity complement each other, or frugality supplements circular economy so that it can fit into the local conditions. So those ideas which are generated in these developing economies, where because there was resource shortage and the resources were scarce and they had to use the available resources to develop their economies. So that could be the ideal situation that we are facing right now. We are having lack of shortage of materials in different scenarios. So to idealize this concept of frugal innovation, to use minimum resources and maximize your efficiency of production or maximize your efficiency or utilizing materials, that's what we are trying to aim. So frugal innovation is a vital component with different concepts from different countries playing a vital role. And this is how we can forecast for the future sustainable development goals also.
We've got a question in online from Freya, and I think it's picking up on something you said, Henning. Her question is, should we be afraid of technology? And if so, what is what's your view on the future role of technology?
Yes, thanks a lot. I mean, you're absolutely right. We have to think about, okay, the role of technology. And for me, there is no good technology and no bad technology, but we have to start thinking about how we use it. And that's where you see the actual impact on resource consumption. So we have to go a bit beyond ideology, especially when it comes to waste incineration, and have to think about the positive role for every possible technology, and then think if it really makes sense or if we have better ideas for that.
because I guess I'm imagining from some of the examples, for example, some of the stuff that Adriana was talking about and Peter was talking about, that actually fourth industrial revolution technologies are quite powerful enablers in some of those circumstances. I mean, do either of you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, if you look, for example, at sorting technology, that helps us a lot to recover plastics and to keep it in a loop. At the same time, for example, in Germany, we became extremely lazy in sorting our waste because we always think, okay, a machine will do it. But the machine, again, requires energy, resources, money. So these dynamics is something that we have to carefully keep in mind if we design the system.
So there's another question here that's from Scarlett, and she is asking, how do people who are not in a circumstance where they have to be frugal get inspired by frugal innovation? I guess the other way to phrase that question, I'm not sure who the best panelist is to take it. The other way to phrase that question is, how might you get started in applying that mindset?
Maybe I could jump in if it's possible. I have some thoughts about this. I think that the way that you think about frugal innovation in a maybe non-frugal context, think about Europe, for example. I think it's the best example that I was speaking with other panelists before this call as well about, which is the fact that if you think about it, it's like a lot of circular economy in Europe is thinking about, you know, using technical equipment, using large-scale infrastructure, large-scale investments, but if you think about the value chain of avoiding, like, take one material, plastic waste, into the conversation, at which point is it the most cost effective, at which point is it the most impactful, is to avoid plastic from being produced in the first place. And behavioral change, I think that's one really big element that is, if you think about it, is quite frugal in nature, because behavioral change is something that is not a large scale investment into infrastructure. It's something different altogether. Yet incredibly important, because a consumer, or, you know, educating, or, you know, somewhat kind of enabling consumers to take a different choice and to avoid plastic in their everyday life means that that item will never be produced in the first place. And you don't need large scale infrastructural investment to deal with that item of plastic waste, if we're able to kind of think about behavioral change intervention. So that's just one example of how you can think about identifying, like, I guess, low monetary investments, I suppose, in the circular economy in a non-frugal setting, and to enable that thinking.
Anyone else have, that feels like quite a question that could be taken up by, I mean, I don't know if you have a view on that, Vivek or Adriana?
Yes, I was thinking more in the natural resources approach also, because we are talking about materials, but when we go to countries that are big agricultural commodities producers, we have to think about, as I said in the beginning, of the supply chain. So how we use less resources such as water and soil and everything to produce more food that is projected until 2050 or something like that. So I think that we need also to look for the natural resources approach, not only the materials one, because, and looking to the social impacts, as Peter also mentioned in his talk, like this, the formal circular economy papers, they don't talk much about it, but those are the ones most affected by the whole complex supply chain, as we said.
I'm just thinking, just a question just popped up in my mind. There's a couple of other great audience questions that have come in, and I'm going to get to those and say thank you so much to people watching at home and in your offices who are sharing those. Can you, I mean, do you, let me see how my phrase. I'm just thinking about this connection between circular economy and frugal innovation. It feels like much of the thread of this conversation has been, how do we embed frugal thinking to enable and help support some of the circular economy transitions, business models, designs, etc. that are happening? Does that also mean, in your views, collective views, that actually the applying circular economy principles is essential to enabling the right kind of frugal innovation? Does that question make sense? Is that my follow-up question to my question?
I can just hopping over there. So it's maybe the other way, like the frugal innovations help in achieving the circular economy. In the sense, for example, about the lunchbox system that is right now developed that is existing in India, that has become so, some companies have already started working on ideas in UK on using this model so that they can provide healthy food. So the idea is how you can find all the available solutions throughout the world and which can be reproduced in other sections or other parts of the world. That's the whole idea. And it should be, you cannot transfer any idea from a developed country directly to a developing country and the other way, the vice versa. It's all about adaptability to the circumstances, adaptability to the geography, culture, the social circumstances. And then this idea will be a success. The frugal innovations really empowers circular economy. And thereby, we believe circular economy is the key to sustainability, sustainable development goals, with all the climate, new studies coming out, dealing with circular economy for mitigating climate change. I think this is one of the great ideas that anyone can adopt throughout the world. Only it's about adaptability.
So we've got a question in here from Stephen. It's it's a good one. Be curious to see who wants this one. I think they're picking up on the point around localization. So obviously, relocalization feels like a key thrust of this discussion, this conversation. And their question is: so we've got massive globalized supply chains. What will be the future role of these if we're relocalizing a lot of activity? Maybe I can rephrase or sort of tack onto that question. You know, is there still a role or value in having these big global supply chains? I mean, I guess we live in a increasingly globalized world. Is some of this thinking actually, trying to undo some of that?
Well, I can maybe start trying to answer that, and I think it's an excellent question. For example, if you look at the current discussion on global exports of waste, and I think that we will need this global trade as long as we import plastic products from other parts in the world. We force these people to use virgin plastics if we ban exports of plastic waste. And I think this is that might be necessary for some cases in some countries, but in the long run, we have to think about ensuring proper recycling regulations, environmental standards all around the globe, and not to try to shut down, for example, the European economy as a closed shop circular economy.
I think as much as possible, I can also talk onto that. Localization localization is one method to achieve CO2 emissions, to achieve those universally agreed upon environmental metrics. So it depends, if you think about globalized supply chains, that is both materials and knowledge and information, right? And I don't think anybody thinks that information and capital needs to be capped in localized way. But within waste, for example, in the developing world, there's this very important concept that is applied called decentralized waste management, which is the idea that you can manage waste within the commercial compound, within the residential complex, within the place that the waste was generated, so that it's as much as possible dealt with on site, wet waste being composted, the plastic waste being sorted on site, and then transported to a local material recovery facility, as opposed to going everywhere. And even when you don't think about exporting, I think we hate so much on the marine export of waste, right? Going from US to places like this, but even within recycling supply chains, there's a lot of local transportation involved as well that we don't think about when we think about plastic or even just general waste recycling, where you have one processor that is taking the waste from a landfill or from commercial complexes in Mumbai, but they had to ship it all across the country to be recycled because the recycler that is authorized for this kind of material is somewhere else, right? So I think that, coming back, that's an example, but coming back to the point is, localization is important in terms of certain, but it's you got to think about it in terms of the metrics. So
Yeah, and I just want to add, that's why I was talking about social assessments, also together with the environmental ones, because we can't forget that there are some communities that actually depend 100% of those supply chains. So they need to feel encouraged to preserve it, to conserve it, to use sustainable business model. That's why it works when you go to the ecosystem service approach, because then you can either way like try to compensate them for the goods that they are extracting. But sometimes, I think most of the times, at least in Brazil, in some regions, they don't have other options. So that can be a pathway, so we can give an alternative, so they can't turn to illegal loggers or something that it's out of the formal supply chain, okay, and causing more degradation and depletion of natural resources.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us this morning, or indeed this afternoon, this evening, depending on where everyone is in the world. And thank you so much to the audience for those questions. I hope that the panelists feel like they've been tested a little bit, and I hope that that's helped increase your understanding of the topic of frugal innovation. All of the information about how to reach out to these guys is obviously on our session page, so do that. This is the last day of the DIF. We do have a few more sessions left, and I want to just highlight a couple of those, right, starting shortly at 11 a.m. GMT, so in about 15 to 20 minutes time. We are looking at Hexagrow, a homegrown urban farming solution, growing vegetables in a pot in your home. So check out their innovation. And then at 4 o'clock, we're asking the question, well, if we can survive on Mars, we can thrive on Earth, and learning a little bit, and very much linked with some of the frugal innovation discussion here. You know, when you go and travel in space, you've got a lot of finite things to work with, and what are some of the lessons we can apply to the way we design on Earth. So thank you so much again, once again, to our panelists in this session. Really look forward to seeing you all viewing at home or in your offices on the DIF again soon, and look forward to seeing you again on the DIF.